So I'm here with Zachary Strong, I'll just use this intro, an engineering physics grad from McMaster University and the author of Ticket to Heaven, as well as the host of the channel Zachary Strong, where he talks about Judaism and his theory called full system physics. So I guess I wanted to start by just asking, like, for your elevator pitch for full system physics and how you say that relates to the Jewish oral tradition.
Sure, sounds good. So basically, as an engineering physics graduate, when I started, questing into spiritual matters, one of the questions that was obvious to me was, the Big Bang and, how did that fit with Genesis and old universe versus young universe and all that stuff. So I dove into, a couple of the papers, like the key Big Bang papers, like Inflationary Universe by Andre Lind. And I also went into some aspects of the Jewish oral tradition, which now, 80 years after the Holocaust and stuff, the rabbis have been able to put together responses from their oral traditions. So it's interesting because, I guess when you think in terms of the last 150 years, a lot of what we take as, kind of given is relatively new. So it took some time, I guess, for the responses to be developed. But basically, I came across what I call anomalies, basically, kind of in scientific revolution, structure of scientific revolutions. There's anomalies like the photoelectric effect that moved classical to quantum, right? And so I'm looking at I was looking at some anomalies as an engineering physics graduate. And, for me, it was okay, so the universe came from this singularity thing. So that's kind of a boundary condition issue. And then I don't know how I came across it, but a paper was released in 2023 about killing fields decohere quantum superpositions. And generally, that was about the edges of black holes and the edge of the universe act as a kind of observer. And it's okay, so why aren't we asking any questions about what the properties of what is beyond this that is causing it to act like an observer, right? And then you get into the classical theist arguments. But, I grew up in a Christian household because my grandfather's a minister, right? So I grew up with all of that. And, the Christians, no offense to them, but they just don't have convincing arguments, partially because they rejected the Jewish oral tradition because they didn't like the Pharisees, right? So that cuts them off from all of the oral tradition, all of the commentary on Genesis and so on, right? And Exodus and everything. So it's once I started diving into some of those problems, I stumbled into Judaism after talking to a rabbi. And so I would say I put a lot of pieces together between 2021 and 2023. So Ticket to Heaven, I wrote between August 2022 and August 2023. And that was kind of me finally putting the theory of everything together, I guess you could say. I don't know if that answers your question. That's probably a bit of a ramble, but.
Oh yeah, no problem. So I asked you about two different things related to what you talked about with respect to the Big Bang model. Is what do you think about the model one? Because from that paper, the thing that they immediately came up with is that this seems like almost experimental confirmation of John Wheeler's self-excited circuit idea, that there's this closed loop wherein observers give rise to quantum information, that quantum information gives rise to the laws of physics, and the laws of physics are somehow fine-tuned in order for the proliferation of observers, and that allows for the self-creation and self-maintenance of the universe. And then also I'd ask, because the most common theistic take on the Big Bang is the Kalam cosmological argument put forth by these guys like William Lane Craig and others, that if there is a first cause to the universe, then there has to be a first causer. So do you put a temporal start to creation? And well, so this is two questions, but do you put a temporal start to creation in the sense that anything that has a cause needs to have a causer, and therefore that cause is God? And what do you think about the self-excited circuit idea and the participatory universe?
Yeah, the participatory universe sounds cool to me. Like I'd have to look into it a bit more, but the general idea, like what you're saying, makes sense. Like there's interactions between observers, things that are observed. It's kind of what I came across the word generative in a different context, like creativity, more like Eric Erickson stuff. But when I think I've seen CTMU folks describe the universe as generative, and that is kind of, like that is generally what Judaism is saying, is that the universe is participatory. You make decisions, you get rewards and punishments based on your decisions. Now, the prime mover argument, like I never found that terribly convincing, partially because it was like pure philosophy. Like maybe I'm just like I come from a blue collar town, blue collar family, and so on. Like I guess you could say I'm like a vote philosopher. But it's like the pure philosophical arguments I never found convincing one way or the other. I needed hard evidence. And so, when I came across the claims that Orthodox Judaism was making, and then I dove into those claims and tested them, against various things, like, some of the Big Bang physics, like Egyptology and so on. It's like, okay, this is actually checking out. Whereas, I was in 2018, 2019, I was, exploring spirituality, getting back into Christianity and so on. But it was like, there were mysteries, there were things that didn't make sense, that, had never made sense. And people just step past them and, pretend like, okay, like we'll figure it out eventually. Right. And that is almost like what, Thomas Kuhn is describing with the structure of scientific revolutions, is there's these anomalies that hint that there's something else. Right. And it's like, some people ignore the anomalies, some people investigate them. And sometimes the anomalies are like red herrings or noise, right? But sometimes you tug on the rope a little bit, you get quantum physics, right?
Yeah. And do you believe that there is a temporal origin to the universe, in the sense that both theistic personalism and now modern physics believe, even though they differ by a number of orders of magnitude on how old the universe is, that there was actually an origin point in time? Or is it just the distance to that origin is what we're observing it now, but it's actually the universe itself is a timeless process?
All right, so I'll dive real deep into some of the Jewish literature.
All right.
Okay, so the timeline, from what I've read, the timeline for all of this begins 2,000 years before the creation of our universe or so. Okay, and during that time, the concept of time was created. The concept of other beings, other than the infinite, the concept of other was created. The concept of time was created. So once, I guess you could say the substructure was set up, there was a process of creation and destruction of worlds, which relates to the paradox of free will. I've covered it like on my channel, but I think it's an unresolvable paradox in a way. But in the way that the omniscience free will paradox is, generally considered unsolvable. But so there's creation and destruction of worlds, partially because once a world is created, all of its possible futures come into being. I think this might have been a Hawking derived idea. I credit it to a friend from high school who was talking to me about it 15, 18 years ago. So I call it Downey's set of all possible futures to give him maximum credit. all of the possible things that could happen. God creates a world, sees, okay, there is no chance that this world is going to turn out to be, a decent habitable place. So you can chuck it immediately, create a new world. So after a little while of that, we get to our universe, right? And basically, the way that our universe works is that the Torah, all 613 commandments, the point of the universe was for someone, or ideally, a group of people, to accept the Torah, like the full Torah, 613, do the kosher, do the kippah, the tzitzit, all of it, right? So it's like that is kind of the goal, because those 613 commandments are like elements of the infinite. Okay, so sorry if I'm going on tangents, but it's like the more that you conform to the infinite, right, the more infinite you can receive. It's kind of like going to a party and matching the vibe of the party, right? Like if you are going to, a university faculty club, and you show up dressed like a rock star, right? And you sit down, you slap the table, and you're like, yeah, man, I love physics, right? It's just not going to fly in the faculty club, right? So you got to match the vibe. And the way that non-Jews fit in is basically like there was like Abraham, and Abraham is significant because he was the first person to kind of figure out the Torah on his own and start living it. And so kind of his descendants went down to Israel, and that's how you have the Jews, right? So they're keeping the 613 commandments. That's all good. And it's like, what do? We have, like, non-Jews have a reduced set of commandments. There's 7 that break out into a whole bunch, but they're all generally intuitive, like be a good person, don't destroy the universe around you, etc. Right? So that is kind of how it goes. Like 2,000 years before our world was created in, Jewish terms, there was some creation and destruction of worlds. Then you get our world. Our world had merit because God foresaw that there were chances for people to accept the Torah. Abraham ended up doing, a really good job. Isaac, Jacob did a really good job. Then there was the Egypt thing, Sinai. Israel accepted the Torah at Sinai. So that's kind of like, and when we look at the Bible, this is the crazy thing. When we look at the Christian Bible, for example, which is what most people are familiar with, you only get a fraction of that because the rest of what I just shared with you is in the oral tradition, right? So, and then if you might ask, like, what is coming next? A whole bunch of, Gog Magog end time stuff, basically, which is, it is what it is. But then, like, the goal of creation was always to accept the Torah. So if Adam and Eve had not have ate the forbidden fruit, they would have made it to the bonus level, and then all of like the evil temptations that we're faced with, like in Shabbat or the Messianic era, or what I call the bonus level, like evil is destroyed. That's when you get swords to plowshares and so on. But because Adam and Eve didn't quite make it in the Garden of Eden, we had to start a whole 6,000-year process, of which we're in, like the Jews say, and I say, we're in the year 5,784. I don't know if that makes sense. That was probably a big answer, but like, basically, like, there were worlds before ours and so on. And the point of the universe basically is to learn and grow. And because when you make positive growth decisions, you're generally aligning yourself with Torah, right? Like, it's like I'm oversimplifying a bit because there's, rules and commandments and so on. But generally, when you think of happy people living in a village, being nice to each other, and so on, that's kind of what we're supposed to be up to.
Yeah, and I'd take it from that you accept generally the biblical timeline of history.
Oh yeah, so I think I became a young earther around the time I must have become a young earther in like spring 2023. As far as I'm concerned, we are in the year 5784. And it's wild because as a physicist, right? And like as a person of science and so on, I never thought I would be taking that position, you know?
Yeah, and then is the act of create, because then if you do have a temporal start to creation, you would have a similar case to the Kalam cosmological argument that that God did at some particular point in time create the universe after this series of drafts. And so I guess who is God and how does God relate to the universe? Because my understanding is that a number of the sort of Jewish mystical traditions have sort of a panentheistic view of God, where God intersects with the physical universe as well as extending beyond it.
Yeah, actually, I've got a couple of cool things about that. So one I got from a book about Kabbalah and modern physics, and it talks about the concept that God is basically everything, right? And I think the CTMU, like I looked at, a summary of a lot of the concepts, and it basically suggests that there is kind of this thing outside of the universe, like at least on the website that I saw. So it's like God is technically everything. And you can find this in the first words that religious Jewish children learn when they're kids, and it's the last words Jews say before they die. I'm not allowed to fully pronounce it, but basically it's Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem, which means, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, Echad, right? So a big part of Judaism is that God is one, but God is also infinite. And one of the things that I like struggled with, with the Christian stuff was, and I don't want to bash them or anything, but it's like they're just the main purveyors of biblical stuff in the scene right now, in the mainstream. So they struggle with the problem of evil, right? And a lot of Christians, when you talk to them, they have a kind of a dualistic belief where they think Satan is this autonomous, rebellious angel that is acting against God. But that doesn't actually fit within Judaism, because God is everything, right? God also made Satan and is controlling everything. And so, there are plenty of answers for why this is the case and so on. But you can think of it like Satan is the AI, like almost like an AI that was fire and forget, and its job is to just cause trouble. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, we'll get into the Christian stuff later. I just with trying to get a sense of your worldview broadly. The
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so I think two of the things that you said reminded me of quotes from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the seventh leader of the Chabad Hasidic movement. Is the or it's not a direct quote, but he says, with respect to the behavior and the Torah commandments as well, and Jewish way of life, and the kind of teleology of history. He says one, like, you could try to figure out life on your own and do good things, but we have a tradition of 3,300 years that has worked for people and has led to broad flourishing. And then he had a very interesting quote. What I like on is a commentary on the story of Adam and Eve, which is that we've exiled God to some place that's transcendent or outside of physical reality, that can only be contacted in meditation or prayer or extreme circumstances, whereas God, it says, referring to the fall of Adam and Eve, he says, God pleads, like, let me return to my garden, to the place in which I found delight when it all began. So I don't know if you want to expand on either of those two things, or just giving you.
Yeah. Okay. So you can, like, I would imagine, and I can't give you like a precise number. Like, I don't know the number, but imagine like a ruler with degrees of holiness. Okay. Like maybe 100. We'll say 100.
Okay.
Okay. So when the world was created, Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were created. they're like, yeah, this is cool, right? So that world is at 100% holiness. When Adam and Eve, ate the fruit that they shouldn't have eaten, the world dropped a whole bunch of degrees. And then also after the flood, the world dropped a whole bunch of other degrees. And when you look into the Jewish literature, reality like the way reality worked actually changed. Like the atmosphere of the earth changed after the flood, which is why you got the rainbow. And like a lot of that stuff, I would not have even believed it at all, except, the Jewish faith claim stuff that I looked into, which was blockchain, Exodus, Genesis. Like that gave me the understanding that all of this stuff makes sense and it's all internally coherent. But one thing I think you mentioned, like in your last question about God, how God relates to us, I've got to look up the exact verse, but I think it is the first thing that God says to the Jewish nation in Exodus 20. And I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. I think that was the first thing that was said. When like that sentence, I'd have to look up the source for it, but there's a hidden meaning in that sentence, which is unlocked with the oral tradition. And the hidden meaning that I remember is I put myself in writing. So the Torah, if you want to use a video game analogy, it's the user's manual for co-creating the universe. And you can think of it as a co-creation because in Genesis 1:28, God says, let us make man in our image. And one of the implications of that is we are co-creating ourselves with God, right? So it's very participatory. The fact that, for example, like, yes, the divine presence has been exiled and we can only access it through prayer and so on. However, at the same time, God put himself in writing in the form of the 5 books of Moses and also the prophets and the writings, because those are considered to be divinely inspired as well. So
yeah, and then one of the things that you've talked about on your channel is this idea of Orthodox Judaism and the Jewish oral tradition as a blockchain that preserves knowledge. So I'm interested in what your model of that is, I guess.
yeah, sounds good. So like some super blockchain nerds are going to get probably really angry at me, but one of the things that I look at in my work is like correspondences between almost like the directions of equations. For example, the Gibbs free energy equation implies certain forms of relationships between the variables, right? That's all an equation really is. It's just an elegant way of showing complicated relationships. So, oh no, that was an important tangent, but I lost the question.
It was like what is the why do you refer to Orthodox Judaism and the Jewish tradition as a blockchain that preserves knowledge? Like what's the significance of that?
Okay, yes. Okay, so that tangent aside, what you have with a blockchain is a bunch of computers, right? All with like a ledger communally basically figuring out what transactions are legit and what transactions aren't, right? So you have basically a crowdsourced process. In marketing and stuff, they call it crowdsourcing. In other applications, they probably call it distributed computing. But basically, it's many independent entities all confirming the same thing, right? So people really like this idea with blockchain, but the Jewish nation, right, in Exodus 19 and Exodus 20, they stood at the foot of a mountain and they all had the same experience. The creator of the universe addressed them. And at that point, it was a lot. So they elected, a prophet, Moses, right? And so everyone in the Jewish nation, which was about 3 million people, right? They all could look at each other, look at their neighbor and say, did you see that? You saw that? Okay. And then they taught their children and they taught their children's children and their children's children's children. And so what you have is each generation is like a link in the blockchain. And then on top of that, you have the written Torah and you have the other written elements like the Talmud and stuff, which it was pre-existing oral tradition, which was written down because of oppression. But so the Talmud wasn't created during that time. It was just capturing things that had already been passed down for a long time. And so that, I think, is extremely powerful, because the next best claim that can be made about a group witnessing, something like that would be something like the 500 people that Paul alleges witnessed Jesus's resurrection, right? But the problem with that, I found, was that who are those people? What are their names, right? Like, where are their children? Where, like, is there, like, you know what I mean? It's just in the Bible, it said, oh, there's 500. People just take it for granted, right? But me, I can walk, 30 minutes this way, knock on someone's door that has a mezuzah and say, hey, like, your people met God? And they'll say, yeah, like, right? So it's different. It's different. And then on top of it, one of the books I wrote, I actually released this in September because the Jewish stuff, it can be very long and involved. So I released a tiny book called Occupiers, which was, fortuitously timed, I guess. But basically, I take the Jewish nation to court in a way, like almost criminal court. And I say, okay, so you have your witness testimony. How do you corroborate this, right? Where is your alibi? Where is your alibi? Their alibi is the Exodus, which, insert a bunch of complicated Egyptology here, we can demonstrate happened, right? And then Genesis confirms that it, creator of the universe. It wasn't just like a sub-deity or something, So that's kind of how it goes, like blockchain, corroborated by Exodus, corroborated by Genesis.
Okay, so we'll start with this sort of it. Do you agree with, because where I sort of take issue a little bit with is with the like Jewish exclusivist claim, but I'll ask you, like, do you agree with, Moses Maimonides famously writes in his letter to Yemen, where the people, the Jewish community in Yemen writes him because there's a person who claims to be a prophet who wants to reconcile Islam and Judaism, and he's attracting a lot of followers, and they write to Maimonides, and they're like, what do we do? And he says that although other religions appear similar, that Judaism is like a flesh and, like if you think of a bunch of statues versus a real person, they might look the same on the outside, but one is a flesh and blood creature, whereas the other is just superficially resembles it. So I guess, do you agree broadly with that point of view?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of a way to explain it, because I had to come to this belief from the outsider belief. And I'm trying to think of like the steps that I took. But basically, because of Abraham's tremendous merit, and because of also, Isaac and Jacob, and because of just the way things shook out, the Jewish nation received the user's manual. Other people, there are prophets among the nations, like Balaam, I think in Numbers was one of them. Right, so other nations have had prophets and so on, but the Jews accepted the Torah, and I guess you could almost say, like, yes, it is exclusivist, but it's almost like, I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, like let's say you want to join like the army, right? Let's say you want to join the army because the army has a specific vibe. They have certain standards and so on, right? And with God, I would say you can say there's generally, if you had to simplify to two things, there's righteousness and there's holiness. Okay, and so holiness implies being kind of set apart and so on. And so it just seemed like, based on my reading, it seems to me that people who are Jewish, and you have to remember, like being Jewish is matrilineal. for metaphysical reasons, it goes through the mother and only the mother. You get your tribe from the father. So for various reasons, the Orthodox Jews, and the Orthodox Jews specifically, have the metaphysical equipment to handle these things, partially because they've accepted, all of these commandments on themselves, right? It creates, it's, if you imagine each commandment as like a cable coming out of your body, right, that connects you to the infinite, they've got 613, and non-Jews have about 100 different commandments, and I'm looking into that as well. But so they just have more stuff because they've got to keep the kosher and so on. And so one of the perks that comes with that level of commitment is access to things like deeper levels of the Torah, things like being able to do miracles, things like, Kabbalah and so on, right? Like people and the thing is, people know that I'm into the Jewish stuff, and I'm on Discord servers sometimes, right? And one of the questions I often get asked about is Kabbalah. Everyone wants to, not everyone, but a lot of people are kind of curious about Kabbalah. They want to learn Kabbalah and so on. But if a non-Jew with no Torah training, no understanding of Hebrew, no understanding of Jewish metaphysics, if they decide to open the Zohar and start ripping through the Zohar willy-nilly, they are going to end up exactly like Madonna, right? And what did Madonna do a decade ago? Kabbalah. She tattooed the Sephirot on her wrist. It's like, oh my goodness. And now her fans are worried. We love Madonna, but Ray of Light is a solid song. But, right now people are worried.
Sort of Kabbalistic in theme.
Yeah. Yeah. The songwriters did a good job with that one, or maybe she wrote it herself. But yeah. But it's people, you can almost imagine non-Jews, we are rocking BMW, Audi engines. They're solid engines. These are good engines, right? But if you want to start, diving into the Kabbalah and, doing some of the things that people consider Jewish exclusivist, it just, you have to sign on for the full commitment, right? That's kind of how it works. It's more of a level of commitment thing, which enables metaphysical things rather than just being a lineage issue. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and well, it's interesting because I've kind of come from the opposite direction. My mother's a Jew, my whole family, all of my ancestors are Jewish, and studying metaphysics and philosophy and all these things, I've kind of come to the opinion closer to the perennial philosophy, that there is sort of a core structure to all of these different religions, and that they are in some sense reaching towards the same fundamental truth. I guess because I see the same valid truth claims basically being made in you can debate Christianity, but also Sikh, Islam, and other sorts of scriptures. And I guess I take a more general approach to that. I don't know what you're.
Well, I would say I follow some of the more stringent rabbis in Orthodoxy, but I would probably be considered, relatively perennial compared to a lot of folks. I'm fluent in other belief systems and so on. In not all belief systems, obviously, but I'm fluent in a bunch because I've explored them right on my way to being a Noahide. So it's the crazy thing is that at the hardline Jewish position is that all of these other religions were originally Torah that then got garbled and so on, possibly after the dispersion, the Babel dispersion, so that the hardline Torah view would be that, oh yeah, all these other religions are getting towards these truths because they originally stemmed from Judaism, right? What was transmitted from Adam and so on, like the antediluvians, basically. That would be the hardline Torah position, which I would technically agree with. Like, for example, the Buddhists have reincarnation, right? They figured out that, like, this isn't just a one-time deal, right? The Christians figured out, things like selflessness and so on. Islam has figured out the Sephirot of Netzach, or victory, I guess you could say. That's a deep Kabbalistic reference, I guess, but like Netzach.
Is that you're saying that jihad would be the same as Netzach?
Maybe Netzach unleashed, right? Could end up being jihad, right?
Mm.
But like not even jihad. Like they are not. Okay, so I guess if we had to use like Greek terms, like, you can either have kind of like a triumphant, heroic civilization or a tragic civilization. And like what I see with Islam, right, is actually a lot of heroic type stuff. Like, for example, I'm not trying to stand for them or anything, but the Taliban, okay, they defeated the United States with horses, okay? I saw pictures of these guys with horses and all of this stuff, and it's like that is a tremendous achievement, regardless of however you want to add valence to it. Like it's like I guess with a vector you have magnitude and direction. The direction, obviously, but the magnitude, there's a big magnitude there, right? And so when I look at Islam, like I see that kind of attitude, right? And in Canada, for example, they're like, Muslims are some of the only people that drive, conversations forward in some respects, right? Because they like, that's Netzach. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. And then because part of what I see is that I feel like the CTMU is firmly almost in the tradition of philosophically of a number of the Jewish mystics I'd put in. I'd include in there the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe, and some of that line. I think, but I feel like an important part of that is that, like, it's not Jewish, and it's saying that this is actually the core structure of all of religions. And it seems like you're not, like, you need a more, like, even taking those same things. Like, I think that for instance, from what I've read of the Tanya is very good philosophically and has a number of important elements. But I also see some of those same things, like in like Sufi metaphysics. There's a famous quote from Rumi, who's a Muslim philosopher, of that you're not a drop in the ocean, you're the entire ocean in a drop. And that very accurately reflects the CTMU ideas of hology and self-similarity. I think the Christian idea of the logos and of reality as a teleological language is important to understanding reality. And so what I see is that in the outward expression of religion, in the kind of exoteric, I don't know if that's a word, but in the outward expressions of different religions, you have a difference, but then what they converge on is some broader metaphysical model. And I think that there's even if, and I don't know enough to make this case, but even if, let's say that the the Tanya was taught in the Baraita, and it was the best thing ever taught. Like, I still think that that's only because it's reaching at the same fundamental truth as all of these different religions and faith systems.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like one of the things I saw with the CTMU is that it shows that, like, there's like language and structures are similar across all of these different levels of analysis. And it's very interesting because in 1998, Edward O. Wilson released Consilience and said, we need this to happen, right? We need all of these disciplines to come together. We need to work towards a unified theory. And then I think Chris Lang was working and releasing stuff around that time. And then, in terms of the mainstream impact, 1999, Jordan Peterson released Maps of Meaning, and he had been cooking that for 15 years. And that basically showed that, heroism and villainy are related to human neuroscience. You can find them in social systems and so on. So, Edward O. Wilson released the book about consilience. Peterson, then released an actual consilience work along with the CTMU stuff. 2010, I think, was the Nature paper with Carl Friston and the free energy principle. And that is like a Rosetta Stone for a lot of disciplines, right? And so what we're seeing...
The free energy principle is that when we see objects that we're actually only seeing the expected utility and then filling it in based on our sense data.
Kind of. Like, the easiest way I can say it is that the brain is a computer. The senses are kind of like a signal, right? And the brain is just trying to figure out, the brain wants to figure out what's going on. But because the world is so complex compared to the brain's computational capacity, the more efficient thing to do computationally, Carl Friston figured out, was minimize surprise. The brain wants to minimize surprise. And I had to look at the papers and ponder this stuff for 2 years straight to figure out the free energy principle, on a conceptual level. And it's minimizing surprise. So what happens? I'll jump back to, are you familiar with Peterson's stuff?
I haven't read Maps of Meaning, but vaguely.
Okay, you know how he talks about heroes and villains and so on?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, Carl Friston figured out that the brain is trying to minimize surprise. You have two choices. If you get something in your sense data that is surprising, the one choice is to update your mental model, improve yourself, right? Which is what Peterson's made his career on now, right? The other option is to do stuff to the world to make it conform to what you want. So those are the only two choices, basically, is heroism, tyranny. And, we're from a human perspective, the implications of that is what I cover in Ticket to Heaven.
Yeah.
But oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, and Peterson decidedly takes the case of the former. He says, set your house in perfect order before you criticize or try to change the world.
Yeah, exactly. Because and he criticizes, for example, the leftists, because he sees them as trying to change the world, right, instead of improving their own mental model. And one thing that I found, actually, as an educator is that, I'm not an educator, currently, aside from my YouTube, but I was doing stuff with McMaster University for 7 years, and I also spoke at a few others. But basically, around 2015, students were no longer able to solve open-ended problems. So if we took 6 of the best students at McMaster's Degree School of Business, if we took the 6 best and we put them on a team, and then Pepsi came to them, and they said, we're trying to realign our Ruffles brand with Gen Z, your demographic. Okay, so help us figure out how to communicate our Ruffles brand and what it is. Very, very difficult time. And around that time, I was also talking to a math professor who mentioned that he's noticing that students would email him asking where the exam or the midterm was, right? And this had never happened before. And there's a lot of other data points, but what I've noticed is that, to some extent, for me, for example, I didn't have the internet till I was 13, except in school, right, on the Pentium 2s or whatever. And I didn't have a phone until I was 16, didn't have a smartphone until I was 22 or 24 even, right? So I'm actually a technological laggard. I'm like an old person. And when I have a question, when I want to figure something out, I Google it, Google Scholar, buy a book, figure it out. But the problem with, younger generations and kind of all generations right now is I notice a lot people are asking each other for things that would take 30 seconds to Google, right? And it's kind of like a hive mind situation. But the problem is that because everyone is asking the average, everyone is regressing to the mean. If you know what I mean. Whereas the other extreme, like so one extreme is hive mind, and that's kind of what I've seen people tend towards post 2015. But the other extreme would be like kind of me, a reclusive scholar who kind of sits and reads tons of books and improves my mental model and writes books and all this stuff. So that's the kind of other extreme. You kind of want to be in the middle where you are as strong a link in the information chain as possible. Maybe you're a subject matter expert, whatever, and you appropriately lean on other people, right?
Yeah.
But, for example, emailing the professor asking where the midterm is, like that would be like when I went to university in like early 2010s, that would be unthinkable, right? But people do it. Like it's just different times, different ways of getting information. But those different ways of getting information afford us more or less valuable brain cycles, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's what Pure Avos says the who is wise, he who learns from everyone, so that you both have to have as strong a mental model, and that you're balancing two variables of both being as correct as possible and then helping as many other people as possible and getting help from those people as well. And so there's kind of a tight balance between those. I sort of interrupted you earlier with the ask about the free energy principle, but we were talking about the relationship between Judaism and, let's say, the core structure of all of the different religions and belief systems, which Chris Langan identifies as the CTMUs. That's the language that actually extends over every religion and distributes over them as the basis for intelligibility and truth claims.
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting because before the interview, I was looking back through Ticket to Heaven, just like doing a refresh, because that book has 1,000 references. I have no idea how I did that, but like basically, I start like my original goal with this book was, and actually I'll briefly explain, I'll take us on a tangent and then I'll get to kind of the core structure of the universe.
All right.
The thing that I was curious about was the fundamental mechanisms of human development, whatever those might be, right? Kind of like the general forces that drive human development. So in 2016, I got tapped on the shoulder to do a research project at McMaster. That turned up some data which showed that language was related to problem-solving ability. So I mentioned earlier, for example, that some, students were not able to solve open-ended problems. I did like 40 hours of interviews with a bunch of different students going through a certain program. And basically, I found that there were a couple that not only did they objectively perform better in the program and add more value as a team member, but their language was more sophisticated. And I'm not talking about big fancy words. I'm talking about using conditionals in their language, like, well, although X, Y, Z, A, B, C, right? So there's like they're comparing two things in their language and the structure of their language. And so that led me down some rabbit holes, which I've documented in some of my books. And then eventually through that, I got to the free energy principle and the neuroscience stuff, because it turns out that we exist on a trajectory of sophistication, and acceptance and growth choices are the things that move us up the progression, right? And then there's actually different stages of how people make meaning, right? And one of those stages is being able to deal with paradoxes, right? So what I ended up doing was grounding a bunch of disciplines in physics, right? So, and I realized that, like, maybe this is ridiculous to say, but what Chris Langan has done for physics and the hard sciences, I went through, the humanities and social sciences with Ticket to Heaven, and I connected a lot of dots in the same way to show that there is a core structure to human nature.
Yep.
There is a core structure, and this grammar is also, like, we aren't just isolated entities. We exist in social systems. We exist in a world system. We exist in a universe system, right? To some extent, right? And Judaism has more on that. But so I basically looked at, a whole bunch of different things across social systems to figure out, what is the structure, right? And one last thing related to this would be the reason that we didn't know this, or one of the reasons, was that the steam engine and the power loom got invented in the 1700s. And then over the next 100 years, people moved into cities. They became what I call colonized. Anyone who's watching this, if you want, there's a band called the Hallucination, separate words, Hallucination. They've got a song called The Virus, right? They've also got a song called Land Back and a song called Working for the Government. So over the 1700s and 1800s, especially because of European statecraft, industrialization, and so on, humans actually became contorted. We became systemic beings and not necessarily organic beings. But then Freud and Breuer and Anna O, put together modern psychology. And after that point, 150 years or whatever after the steam engine was invented, that is when people started asking questions about human nature. That is when they started taking population averages to decide what people are, right? Abraham Maslow railed against this in the 60s, and that's turned into positive psychology. But the implications of this, which I talk about, in Ticket to Heaven, is that we exist on an upward trajectory, and it's closer to, what I mean? Like, even from secular standards, we're looking at, humans being heroic, humans being courageous, humans overcoming, right? All of these things that the mainstream doesn't necessarily embrace right now, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. Like, on that timeline of the like mid 1700s to the present, you have basically the largest change in human social organization in that duration of time in recorded history. Because you have you have the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and basically everything changes during that time. But it's interesting. This might be a little esoteric for a popular audience, but but whatever. So this is one of the things that that Chabad talks about, and might be a way to interpret what the CTMU's role is from the perspective of the Jewish blockchain. Is the Baal Shem Tov dies, and he says that like there's gonna be a baby. I don't remember the day. He says there's gonna be a baby born on like maybe the 14th of Elul. Don't quote me on that. It was some day, and which is the same day that the Baal Shem Tov was born, and is also the day that the Alter Rebbe was born later. This is the story, and basically the idea is that he's the Schneer Zalman of Liadi, because it's two lights. It's both. He has the light of explicating the system of metaphysics in the Tanya, as well as the light of explicating a system of Jewish law in his commentary on Yosef Karo's the Shulchan Aruch. So, and the idea is that there's also a logical complement to that, is that there's a negative force that has to come with every like tzaddik or righteous person that comes into the world. And Chabad believes that that's Napoleon, because the Alter Rebbe and Napoleon had an adversarial relationship, and there are a number of stories of varying believability about that, but the general thing is that he supported the czars against Napoleon, and so you have this long tradition. What I kind of see is, and then the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who's the seven generations down from the older Rebbe, says that basically the world this is close to the time of his death. The world is like scrambling because we're in the last little bit before there is this kind of final convergence of human social organization that's expressed in the Messianic era in Jewish theology. So the and he says like the spirit 5750 corresponds, if you have the 6,000 year cycle, to high noon on the sixth day of creation. And it's like everyone's scrambling before Shabbos dinner to get everything ready. And that corresponds exactly with the CTMU and a lot of these other kind of things. And what I kind of see, that's why I was saying that I think it's in that tradition, is that you're taking that metaphysics, recognizing the core structure, and extending that into something that is distributed as a pure and invariant identity over both all of the universe in terms of its syntactic description, as well as all of the different religious systems, and you can have some sort of real harmony thereby. And so I think that in order to, even though I do think that the Jewish metaphysics, and I've read I've read the Tanakh, and I've also read the Guide for the Perplexed by Maimonides, and a lot of that is actually very good philosophy, but I think you need to actually extend that to that it's not that like everyone is made in all people and all religions are made in the image and likeness of God, and there's not really, in my opinion, a good model for like a chosen people, but that you have, and that's sort of like, and that what the CTMU metaphysics is bringing is sort of that for the masses.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because like one of the things, I think it's actually in the Tanya, mentions that I'd have to look it up, but like it alludes to, I think, that the science and knowledge and stuff that we have now is kind of a product of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
Like in a way, you could say that all of the things that Adam and Eve would have discovered in Shabbat, we are finding out, you could almost say, the hard way. And I'm doing this because we're cascading through history, finding out different things, making more discoveries, right? And it seems to me, I'm kind of in agreement in certain ways, where like I'm, I guess you could say I'm hardline with the Jews, but people have questions, right? People have questions, and you need to be if you're trying to, tell somebody about a religion, right? You have to be able to explain it to them in their terms, in terms they wanna. And in my day job, I work as a marketer, so like I'm all about explaining things in the terms people want to hear, right? And the CTMU provides, like, it dovetails with Judaism. It provides people with the science, right? But like a lot of the science behind it. I get at aspects of things with Ticket to Heaven, right? So once you start putting all these things together, you have, a very comprehensive view, right? However, like, I have to be careful and say that technically, if we had just followed the Torah, we would have discovered all this stuff on our own with a lot less, genocide. But, we're here now, and it's been a fun journey. For some people, I guess you could say, but it's like everything seems to be converging, and that's the thing that I like about the CTMU, is that some of the most, I would say, rigorous and in-depth thinking about the structure of reality, right, is aligning with Judaism, and and at the same time now Judaism coming out with responses about faith claims and so on. And then in August, September of this year, I kind of jumped into the ring, waving my ticket to heaven. So it's overall like people are like, I would say researchers and disciplines and fields are coming together more. And I think, for people with sophisticated scientific questions, or people who are even just predisposed to want to understand things a certain way, right? The CTMU, from the Jewish perspective is I would say quite valuable. And also based on what I've seen, like the fact that Chris Langan was able to like think about this stuff and put it together, right? Like that is tremendous, absolutely tremendous, right? So, I like overall, like I see similar to you, I see these things as like different facets of the same truth, but I just have a different hierarchy of things.
Yeah, and I think part of what this might be a longer term project because I have a number of things I want to do in the next couple of years. But one of the things I want to do in the future is kind of like go through I've read the Tanakh, but like go through the Tanya and Jewish philosophy and kind of see and like maybe like actually like write out a commentary on like what is the correspondence between that and the CTMU. But I do think that that there is some sort of like that like objectively speaking, in my opinion, that Christopher Langan is the best thinker alive today because in my like he's the only person who, at least who I've seen, who like you could just ask any question about any facet of existence and you'd get a full and a comprehensive answer. So I think that I think that but I do think that there is a promising avenue for the further reconciliation of that. I don't know if there's any close. Well, I'll ask like, what do you sort of touched on this, but like, what do you think about the CTMU and further, like, does this is a weirdly phrased question, but like, does the CTMU need to be interpreted in Judaism or Judaism in the CTMU? Because you talk about this hierarchy problem.
Yeah, I would put Judaism at the top because CTMU, one of the things is I think it bottoms out at quantum foam or something. Like I was looking, and like there are limits to it. And the CTMU like is really good with stuff in our universe, but the stuff beyond our universe, you need Kabbalah for that, basically. So, CTMU is nested within Judaism, but like I'm looking at the like a summary of CTMU. It says like reality is a language that talks to itself about itself. It's like in every point that I see on this page, like it makes sense with Judaism, So I think like one of the things that excites me as a scholar is all of the reconciliation work that can be done, right? Because I've been able to do physics with the Psalms, which is like, I like some of like how the Psalms talk about bowstrings, that roughly corresponds to what we know as black swan events, right?
Yeah.
And when you use Judaism as the glue, you can see that, okay, we get black swan events because there's tension applied over time and then a sudden snapback, right? So it's a metaphor to describe those types of things. But yeah, it's like the CTMU, what I'm seeing from it, like there's a lot of dots to connect here. I think it would be very, very rich scholarly work. Like you would probably not be able to get funding for it at a university unless like a department head.
Definitely.
But as an independent scholar, like you like doing this reconciliation work, like there's a lot to be done here. So
yeah, and I think that there's many lifetimes of that with respect to all the things that to be unraveled. One point of convergence, let's say, between the Kabbalistic model of emanation and the CTMU is I saw that the article that you reacted to for your video about the CTMU And I think it's actually mistaken in the sense that says that it bottoms out at quantum foam, because what the CTMU actually says is that everything in the universe reduces not to quantum foam in the way that a lot of modern physical theories say, but to a sort of generalization of that called unbound telesis, which is this kind of pure realm of infinite expansive potential from which everything emerges. And I think you could very easily make the case that what Langen is describing there is the same as the Ora Ein Sof, which is basically the transcendent aspect of God in Kabbalistic metaphysics.
Yeah, yeah, and that, I was thinking the exact same thing when you were talking about the Orion. So for people listening who don't speak Hebrew, that's basically light without limitation.
Yeah.
And so yeah, he's I that's a good clarification. Thanks for bringing that up, because yeah, like that's kind of how it all shakes out, right? Like the creation stuff is wildly difficult, and I'm just a relative beginner in it. Like with all the stuff that I'm doing, it's only because I happen to have the physics training, right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, like I think the CTMU, like there's a lot of similarities, and if what you're describing, he's saying it's infinite expansion, like that makes sense. And even I think I saw something about something called conspansion, where it's like a frame rate that the universe.
Yeah.
Okay, like I have to find the reference. It's on Chabad.org somewhere, but the Kabbalists also talk about a frame rate. The divine
Interesting.
light, the divine light is apparently flickering all the time to create and recreate reality.
Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing that. And there's actually I realized this while you're talking about the aura and Sof, is that if you consider it light without information, light without boundaries, that if you consider the light is basically in modern physics considered to be a generalization of information because it's carrying information about a state to observers. Like if a photon from the sun, it can come to me and then it can come to someone else on Pluto 8 minutes later, and it's carrying the same information. And so what light is essentially a generalization of information. And that's actually exactly, light without end. That's actually exactly how, if you translate light to information, then that's how Langen describes unbound telesis, because he says that it's like a realm of zero informational constraint, which means that it's like pure potentiality. So that's interesting. I didn't think of that, but yeah. I guess I think we can probably I guess just closing a little bit. Like what is I asked this to all my guests. Like, what is your advice for me broadly?
Hmm. Hmm. Actually, I've seen some of your content. Like looking like you're looking to change the world, have an impact, right? One of the hardest things I had to come to as a marketer, right, and also doing religious outreach or even just outreach, because I have some coach training. Like I've had some interesting experiences supporting people in tremendous circumstances, right? And kind of like Langen, I was a nightclub bouncer for a few months. And I think there's something about being connected to reality in like a hard sort of way. But anyway, the advice would be like as unbelievable as it may seem, some people could be offered infinity and like everything, and they would turn it down for some personal reason. And like, so when you are sharing these ideas, I've had to learn this the hard way. Like, you have to get good at figuring out who's actually curious and who's open to change versus someone who's just arguing for the sake of arguing, right? Or you know what I mean? Like they present objections and objections, but they don't acknowledge points. And it's like, so you have to like, I had to get good at that. And as a marketer, like I was trying to reach broader broader amounts of people, but I've focused it a little bit more. Like my content on my YouTube channel is a bit different now, and so on. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say is you have to really focus on the people who are ready for change. And with the CTMU stuff, like as soon as someone plugs into things like the CTMU or related ideas of similar magnitude, like that's when they're ready. But for me, for example, like I wrote the book that I wrote, I was originally going to call it something different, but I called it literally Ticket to Heaven, and Utopia is in the title. And then the rest of the title is like the most audacious boasts that you could ever make on a book cover, right? So it's like the book cover screams, read me, and it's called Ticket to Heaven, right? People will still turn it down, even if they know me, right? I've had people from my faith, like from the Noahide group, say like, like I don't want to read it, whatever, it's too complex or whatever, right? And so you just have to accept that some people, don't want the good stuff. You know what I mean? Like some people just are on a different wavelength, they're not ready, etc. So that would be my advice, long-winded, but
Yep. And I'll ask to close just what is the meaning of this all? What is, life, universe, everything, etc. Why are we here? What is the meaning of this?
I would say, I would reference what I mentioned, kind of simplifying to two aspects of God. There's righteousness and then there's holiness. And I think, what is the meaning of all of this, right? All of this, I mentioned this too in a video of mine, but all of that, like the Kabbalists say this is a concealment. Nick Bostrom says this is a simulation. I say this is a developmental simulation. Okay, so the whole concealment, the whole video game, whatever, right, is just so we can basically be righteous and, holy in the case of Jews and holy to various capacities in the case of non-Jews, right? So it's like that is the purpose. And the thing is, it's just, from the Jewish perspective, it's taken us, just 5,784 years to, take the long way around, I guess you could say, and realize that, maybe there are laws to the universe, right? Which there's a lot of people today that say there isn't, right? All we have to do is just realize and remember, I guess you could say.
Awesome, thank you. Any closing thoughts, anything you wanted to end with, or
I guess like if people are curious, like all of my papers and stuff are PDFs. Like I try to put my stuff open source because like one of the problems with modern science actually is that the journals and things like that, like it's more prohibitive and less, awesome than many people think. So channels like this, thanks for diving into these topics and exploring, like the CTMU and sharing the CTMU with people, like this type of work, like making knowledge free. I think it's always a worthy project. So yeah, that's just a closing thought. Like all my stuff on my website is free, and we should try to keep knowledge as free as possible, especially now. So
yeah, and
yeah.
I'll link your webpage in the description. So
Ooh,
awesome.
yeah, thanks. Yeah, and thanks for having me. Like this is like it's cool to talk to people about these kinds of things, Not like I'm sure you might have experienced this. Like not many people are always interested in the intersection of neuroscience and physics and language and all this stuff, right?
Yeah, well, awesome, man. Take care. Have a good evening, and yeah.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And yeah, hope to talk to you soon. And I'm keeping an eye on your channel because like you're putting out good content. Like it's like YouTube is becoming kind of a cool place, it was a little bit rough for a while, but it's it's fun. So yeah, thanks for having me, and yeah,
Awesome. Take care.
you too. See ya.